Hope everybody is doing well on this particular day. It is definitely feeling a little bit more spring-like than it was a few days ago because we were definitely having some chilly weather here in North Carolina, and of course a lot of rainy weather as well. So definitely that was what's happening here, but it definitely was chilly on yesterday evening. But I think it's back up in the mid 60s or something along those lines. So definitely feeling more spring-like, and definitely have had a chance to get out and about and even see some of the animals. Saw that yesterday when I saw a couple of robins that were out and about trying to get their dinner and their lunch on. And yours truly might have to do that later on as well. But we always good having amazing guests and amazing conversations. And I've got a guest that has been on a few times. So I'm interested in hearing about this amazing film that she's got going that is part of the Easter Seals Challenge that they do regularly. And she's been a guest before. So looking forward to having this conversation with Anna Packman and all in that space, and just seeing a lot of the different things that are going on in her life as well. So I'm going to bring in Anna, and we're going to have this conversation and see how life is going. Because as I recall, she's up there in the Northeast or somewhere along those lines in that space. So how is the weather going in your part of the world and all in that space? And how is life just treating you in general?
Yeah, hi Mark. It is so great to be with you and your listeners. Life is good. Life is good. I'm actually here in New York City where it is very sunny and spring-like and warm. So right after this, I'm excited to get outside.
Yeah, I got to get outside myself at least some today because it definitely is a decent day to get that outside environment and all in that space. I do remember that when the pandemic first started, a lot of us were in the homes and oftentimes got very comfortable in our houses and all in that space. But now that things are starting to change in that regards, people are starting to enjoy going out to events, going out to festivals. We actually did a Heritage Film Festival back in I think that was last month that was taking place and all in that space. But what is your own thoughts been about getting out and getting out into the public in general? Because I do think people are starting to enjoy the wonders of nature, and of course, it's springtime now as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I think for me personally, like I have a disability that makes me high risk for COVID. And, thankfully, one of the things we discovered early on in the pandemic is that outdoors, while not 100% foolproof, is much, much safer than indoors and really does not present a very big risk. So, I think like a lot of people, I have kind of adapted my lifestyle to like being more of an outdoorsy person, which I definitely was not before the pandemic.
You mean you were not an outdoorsy person before the pandemic? You were doing more inside work and not doing as much outside work? I actually used to be more outside and got to get more into my outside lifestyle because there's a park not that far from here that I used to go on regular walks to. And then, of course, with this whole pod TV thing, I've been caught up in doing a lot of the work inside, but I have started getting out to one of my other jobs, and I'm starting to try to find ways to integrate the outside and the inside life.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like we're still in a pandemic. So, for me, it's, the outdoors is definitely where I do most of my socializing. And so it's been great that here in New York City, especially on nice days like today, there's a really vibrant outdoor dining scene. And it's great that we've been able to keep that up because there's so many other reasons why people like that besides just trying to stay safe from COVID.
Oh yeah, definitely. And you do have some folks out there that will swear up and down that COVID is over, and I'm not ready to make that declaration yet and everything because I definitely know that there are folks that are constantly still getting sick from it and all in it that way. But you got a lot of folks that will not be trying to think that it's over, and there are some folks that are still not even want to deal with the mask and the vaccines and other things in that space. But I know that you are trying to stay as safe as possible so that you can continue doing all of this great work that you've been doing in both social media as well as in the filmmaking world. So one question I had for you is I know for a fact that you have done a lot of social media work, some of it with oxygen and some with other things as well. So for those that are not familiar with you, tell us a little bit about your social media background and if we're doing some things positive in that regards, even in the way that we're handling things in the disability community as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the things, that's interesting with social media is social media has been just such a great resource for the disability community, I guess as civil marginalized groups, and there's a lot of cross sectionalities, um, that social media has completely democratized media. Now, you don't have to wait for a network to give you a TV show. You don't need to wait for a studio to produce your project. If you're into film, you can produce your own content and you can put it out there. You can put it on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook. There's so many YouTube. There's so many platforms, and all of them, have a very, very low barrier to entry. And so what that has caused is for a lot of disabled creators to be able to get out there and to talk about their lived experience in a way that the gatekeepers never allowed for before. So that's been really exciting to see, in terms of the disability community. And then just in terms of my career, myself personally, it's an interesting story because I actually got my start when I was an undergrad. I was a finance major. I worked here in New York City on Wall Street and for financial services firms for a few years, but it really was not my passion. And I decided to go back to business school to study marketing and kind of happened upon social media as a career path, almost serendipitously because this was at a time, and of course your viewers will think I'm 21, but I'm not. This was at a time when Facebook was just starting to open to everyone, and they just had passed that period when it was only open to people with a .edu address who were current college students. And businesses, for the first time, were starting to get on the platform, and they didn't really know what to do with themselves, on the platform. So there was a lot of opportunity for someone coming in without, years and years of experience, because no one had that. This was all new at the time. And it was something that, I'd gotten involved in early on, just as an early adopter in my personal life, and was able through various internships when I was in grad school to apply that to various business problems, and then was fortunate enough, when I graduated, to get a full-time job at Oxygen, where I ran social media for a couple of years.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. What was it like working for Oxygen and all in that space? Because a lot of folks are not as familiar, but it does seem like it has done some innovative work and all in that ways. And then I've got another question to ask you about one of your other jobs that you had as before as well. And then, of course, definitely want to get into the filmmaking conversation also.
Yeah, sure. So working at Oxygen, especially back in those early days of social, I was actually the first full-time social media manager they hired. It was incredible. They were doing a lot of innovative work in the digital space overall. Huge shout out to Jen Kavanaugh, who was the head of the department, my boss over there. It's just like such an incredible leader, such an incredible innovator. And, as a result, we were kind of a very small network. So Oxygen right now is a true crime network. But back when I worked there, it was focused on reality TV, targeted at women, mostly younger women. Um, Between the ages of like 18 to, I would say, like to their 40s. And we had some shows that were incredibly popular on social media. One was the Bad Girls Club. And another one was a spinoff of the show Glee that was on Fox. We had their spinoff, which was a reality competition series called The Glee Project. And it was just so incredible to work on those properties because they both, for different reasons and in different ways, had such popular fan bases, and just the amount of passion that people have for those shows. It was incredible to be a part of.
No, and speaking of people having a passion, there is and folks have said that even though I've been in North Carolina pretty much all of my life, except for a brief stint in Boca Raton and going to school in Milwaukee, I've had friends of mine that say that you have a New York personality, whatever that means, because I don't know, think that I have an abrupt or a kind of abrupt or aggressive attitude, which I know is the stereotype around New York and everything. But I think it's more of the love of culture and the love of the number of other things that are part of New York. But, when people think about New York, there are people that have a love it attitude. There are some people that can't stand the state and everything. Because I remember, and you'll get a kick out of this, when I was visiting a cousin who was living in New Jersey many years ago, way before the pandemic and everything. He was I wanted to go visit New York, and I wanted to go visit some friends that were in the arts world, the music world, and a number of other cultural worlds. And he was very much a Duke graduate. Ironically, I don't live that far from now and everything, but he was a Duke graduate and enjoyed his kind of bar environment, Jersey boy kind of style life and everything. And when I mentioned when I wanted to go to New York, you would have thought that I was telling him to go to hang out with the zombies and everything because he was not trying to go to New York. But fortunately, I am a person that will go where I want to go when I want to go there. So I managed to go to New York, have a good time in New York, despite the fact that that particular cousin was not trying to go to New York. And one of the things that you used to do is work for the Empire State Development, which did the whole I Love New York and Startup New York kind of campaigns as well. So were you always a big fan of New York, or did you have to have New York grow on you? And what exactly is a New York state of mind? Because I know that that's a popular song, and apparently some friends of mine thought I had a New York state of mind, but I'm not even sure what a New York state of mind is.
Yeah. So first of all, I have to say that I am here by personal capacity, and my opinions are my own, and they're not that of my employer. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, yeah. So first of all, like New York and New Jersey are very different. It's funny. One of my collaborators, and she appears in the movie as well, Mason Zayed. She's very famously from New Jersey. We kind of riff off of that all the time, as well as some other friends in New Jersey. My brother actually, during the pandemic, moved to Jersey. But in terms of me, like I grew up in New York, so I don't know. It's hard to say whether it grew on me or what happened there. But I grew up here. I'm a almost native New Yorker. I've lived here since I was 4 years old. I went to college here. I went to grad school here. So I'm about as New York as it comes. Now, to your other question, the New York state of mind. That's a really interesting question. Um, so when I think of a New York state of mind, I think it's someone who's moving ever forward. Life here is very fast paced. It's someone like you mentioned before, who is cultured. One of the things I love best about living in New York City is the diversity. I could step out my front door and have people say hello to me in 20 different languages, and that's perfectly normal. I could go within a 4 block radius and eat the cuisine of at least as many countries. So, that's kind of the amazing thing here. It's just this huge melting pot. So I think people here are, not to say people, aren't nice everywhere, but like I think there's nice and superficial nice. And I think people here might be a little bit lighter on the superficial, politeness. But if you're in a bind, like you should hope to be here, because like I think in terms of genuinely helping each other and genuinely looking out for each other, that is very much a New York state of mind, because we're constantly, forced to live on top of each other. Quite literally, we're all in apartment buildings.
Yep. No, that's definitely very much the case. Apartment living is very much a big thing. Another thing that I knew you were involved with as well, that is very popular both here in North Carolina and around the country, I would argue even around the world, is this notion of startup businesses. And definitely been a lot of those in New York. And I know that that was one of your initiatives that you were involved in as well. So how big is that startup culture, and has it calmed down at all during the pandemic? Because I do know that a lot of folks, even in the filmmaking world, are doing much more hybrid kind of work and all in that space. But how are the startup initiatives doing, particularly in the Big Apple and in that area of New York?
Yes, and I mean, New York, I think, is a great place for startups because there's just so much talent here, in terms of like, both technical talent and creative talent. So it definitely has been a major hub. And there are hubs throughout the state as well for, certain industries. I think in terms of the pandemic, it's definitely impacted smaller businesses quite a bit, because there was the period where I think here, probably more than some other places in the country, we did take COVID very seriously, and the government here put the safety of people first for a while, in terms of like just a number of businesses that had to, close down before we had vaccines and before, like that big reopening we had a couple of years ago. But things have been reopened. I think the pandemic also has impacted different types of businesses differently. So like I think for example, like your tech startup where people could just keep carrying on from home wasn't impacted as much as, like, let's say a restaurant where their bottom line is completely based on, people going out and, eating at their place in person.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, one of your campaigns that you were involved in is one that I had always heard even before Anna went to work for them and everything, because definitely there have been songs about loving New York. There have definitely been movies about loving New York and all in that space. But so when I read that there was an initiative called I Love New York, and I'm going like, but wait a minute, haven't been people been loving New York and been loving the whole area of New York for decades, if not centuries, and all in that space. So what is it like having this iconic brand, namely New York, and this kind of I Love New York brand when a lot of people are going like, but wait a minute, didn't Frank Sinatra sing about that? Or some of the other folks that would be the folks that definitely stated their love of that great area and everything.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great brand. It's an iconic brand. People, like you see it all over the place. If you ever walk through Times Square here, especially, that there's a lot of merchandise being sold in various shops with the logo. So it's, as a marketer, it's always helpful to have, something that is just so beloved, and people just genuinely all kind of gravitate towards in a positive way.
That makes a lot of sense and everything. And then we'll get to the film next. But for those that are thinking about going into digital marketing or even social media, we know a lot of folks are definitely thinking that they need social media people in their business, whether that's a small business or whether that's a large business. I know some folks are even trying to figure out, do they need to hire a social media manager for their various agencies and their various organizations. But for those that are thinking about hiring one or getting into the field, what advice would you be given in either of those regards? Those that are thinking about going into it and those that want to think, do they need one?
Yeah, so for those who are thinking of going into it, I think the best way to kind of build that muscle is just by doing and really making sure you're familiar with all the platforms. And for those who are kind of more on the business end and, either looking to hire someone or looking to get involved, as a way to promote their business, especially small businesses, I think, that advice applies as well because what you want to always be doing, and this is, just regardless of where you're marketing, is looking at where your customers are, like who's your customer and where do they live. So for example, if your customer base is made up of mostly senior citizens, I probably would say like you shouldn't be spending a lot of time on TikTok. But if you're trying to reach the Gen Z audience, you should be probably spending a lot of your time on TikTok. So it just really depends on who you're trying to reach and where they are. And I think, it kind of goes back to basics in terms of like if I had a business and I was hiring a social media manager, I would want someone who understands the platforms well, but understands marketing really well as well to be able to help you identify a target audience, help you identify where that audience is, help you identify messages that are going to be relevant and actionable for your audience. I think one of the greatest mistakes I see sometimes when I see social media is it's not really clear what the post is meant to do. Like sometimes people will post a nice picture and it's nice, but you got to think, how does it tie back to what you actually, want people to do? What action do you want people to take? What message do you want people to remember?
That makes a lot of sense. And a lot of times people don't think about that message. I did, and we mentioned it briefly on our media show earlier today because we do a media show around 12 or 12:30. And one of the things that I brought up to the attention was apparently our current president is getting ready to hire a bunch of TikTok influencers to actually help with his campaign and all of that. So that had actually just been announced, I think, earlier today and everything. And I did see that one of the things that you had done was actually work on the social media campaign for election 2012, as well as some documentary specials and all in that space. So do you think that our politicians and our folks in the political front are understanding social media, and are they getting it in a sense, or are they not quite understanding what they are doing in your mind?
Yeah, well, you have a broad spectrum. I mean, you have people like AOC, who's a digital native, and then you have like our president, who's literally 80 years old. And not to say that someone who's 80 years old can't, be good at or understand social media, but that's kind of not his thing personally. He has people to help with that. But I think, it just depends. I've definitely seen some like funny clips from hearings where some people in Congress have no idea about what's going on with social media just based on some of the questions they're asking CEOs of these companies. Do not demonstrate a lot of background knowledge there. But I think it's for the same reasons as it's important for a business to reach people where they are. It's also important for politicians to do the same because ultimately, look, there's a like I think there's this old school way of doing things where you put a bunch of ads on TV, and that's like how most career politicians have been used to reaching people. A lot of people have cut the cord, especially young people, and young people are the ones who whatever your political party is, those are the ones who you need to get out the vote to because they're not already going to go and vote. Like they need to be convinced to actually go and participate in the political process. So,
Yeah,
I think it's just a matter of like, being pragmatic and looking at where that population is. And so I think it's really smart of, the Biden campaign, if they're indeed looking at TikTok as a way to get people, because all those kids that just turned 18 and can vote for the first time are like 19. So since, the first time he got elected, they're there. Like that's the main place to reach them.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How important do you think it is to have diverse social media platforms involved in your social media campaign? Because I do know some people that love
Mhm.
getting on LinkedIn and then also having an account on Facebook and Substack in the newsletter space and a number of other kind of outlets. And I know some folks that love putting their stuff maybe on Reddit and then on Al Jazeera America and a number of other kind of spaces. But how important is it to have a diverse social media uh, portfolio?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important because people have their personal preferences. Some people will be on one platform, some will be on another. It's also like you're competing on social with a lot of other accounts, a lot of other messaging. The average person, I think the latest stats are follows about 200 accounts on any given platform. So the chances that your content will be one of those like things that shows up is a little bit of a lot of just a game of chance. So you want to give yourself the best chance to reach as many people with your message as possible. So it does make sense, but at the same time, I think it's important to focus because the social networks are all different. The good news is to some extent you can repurpose content from one network to another. You do have to make it kind of work specifically for that platform, but a lot of your copy can be repurposed, a lot of your images can be repurposed. But like, LinkedIn is a great example of if you're trying to put a message out there that is relevant to businesses or to business people, that is a great platform. If you're looking to sell, like, let's say kitty litter, that's probably not where you should be posting it because people are not in that mindset when they're on LinkedIn of buying a consumer good. They're in the mindset of doing business.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Everything. How much flack did you get, if any, when you were working for Al Jazeera? Because definitely it is a Middle Eastern type platform, and all in that way. And I do know that sometimes people are very um, supportive of folk working for different kinds of platforms and a variety of platforms. But I know that even in New York, some folks can give you that little side eye if you work for certain outlets, whether that's Al Jazeera, whether that's a Mexican newspaper outlet, or I could name a couple of others, maybe even a Black Panther publication. But I'm just wondering, how did that impact your own career when folks found out that you had worked at your time during working at Al Jazeera America?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I actually, the way that I came to work there was Al Jazeera actually purchased a company that I was working for before, which was Current TV, which was owned by Al Gore. It was a progressive small news cable network on TV. And they bought us out with the purpose of creating Al Jazeera America, which was going to be like their channel in the US. And I think there are a lot of, talk about, the importance of like branding. Here's a case study in a brand that had a lot of negative perceptions here for sure among, people because this was right after the movie Zero Dark 30 came out. And, we all sat in the theater watching, an Al Jazeera delivery guy bringing tapes to Bin Laden, right? Like, so that's what the name and the brand got associated with. But, the reality was a little different because Al Jazeera, across the world, for the most part, is known for this really objective high quality journalism, which, to be honest, like for the American audience, like the bigger problem was it was too boring. There was none of that, like, pizzazz that, American audiences expect on TV. It was people, just reading the news in a very matter of fact way. And it was a lot of international news. And you can think about like the various reasons why, like, that was like kind of doomed to not do well here. In addition, to the brand, just not being, something that like, oh, could overcome a lot of the biases that the American audience had towards it because of everything going on, the wars that were started with Iraq and Afghanistan. But that's a whole separate issue.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I had actually forgot about current TV and its connection to Al Gore and everything in that space. And we do know that there have been other attempts of politicians to get into the social media and or the television and it just media in general spaces. Definitely, we've seen that with Trump and Truth, and definitely seen it with some things that even definitely Bernie Sanders had done with some media outlets and all in that space. But I was just wondering your own thoughts. Are we seeing too many politicians delving into the media landscape, or is that something that we've always dealt with? Because we definitely had the Hearst family involved in early media and all in that space. And there have definitely been the whole notion of yellow journalism and other types of journalism that had some political influences. And I can say that as a journalism major and as one that has studied a little bit of journalism history. But I was just wondering your take on the notion of the separation of politics and the media.
Yeah, I mean, I think those two are just so closely entwined because if you think about the way that politicians get elected, it's completely through the media, and that's how they reach potential voters and all that. And just think about even the fact that you could be watching General Hospital and it'll be preempted because the president wants to say something.
Yeah.
Like no one else can do that. Only politicians can do that. You or I can't get on the air, or like a company can't get on the air and be like, actually, like just everyone stop what you're doing, right? So I mean, that's a natural kind of extension. And I think because politicians are so used to going on, networks and media and doing like all kinds of press, it's a natural kind of transition where you do see a lot of them when they're no longer in office, host their own shows or, become a pundit, that kind of thing.
But it makes a lot of sense. Definitely can see that. And on that regard, when did you first decide that you wanted to get into filmmaking after having done all this work in social media and in definitely some of the other aspects of some of your work in marketing? So when did you decide that, hey, I think I should be telling some of my own stories and getting involved in the filmmaking space? I know some of the history, but I don't know all of it. So were you the one that was running around with the camcorder showing the birthday parties and all in that nature, or maybe even some of the religious celebrations that might have been going on in your family, or is this something that was a later in life dream?
Yeah, so I definitely Instagram all my food, but I'm not the person who's running around with a camcorder. Yeah, it's something like I've always loved movies. It's always been a passion of mine. I particularly like the way that my way into it was actually through writing. And I took screenwriting when I was in college and kind of dabbled in that quite a bit. When I was in business school, I was part of a group called Columbia Business School Follies, and we used to produce sketch comedy videos that we were mainly focused around like issues going around our school. And we'd have a show every semester and share them with our classmates. So for me, like I decided, and I've been also, I should say, I've been an advocate for disability representation in the media for quite a while. Having grown up with a disability and rarely seeing people like myself represented on TV or in movies. And, even where there were disabled characters, often we would be represented in a really, just not accurate and offensive way. I remember in particular, there was one episode of a show called Saved by the Bell in the 90s, where that was actually the first time I remember seeing a young woman using a wheelchair like myself. And she was clearly a non disabled actress. And they gave her just the oldest, jankiest hospital style wheelchair that like no self respecting wheelchair user in her, kind of position would use. It just made it look so fake, and it made me wonder, like why would they not, find someone? There surely must be actors who use wheelchairs. Why not find someone who can actually do the role justice, no matter how large or how small? So I've been doing various advocacy efforts and mentoring and all that, especially when I was working in the entertainment industry myself. But, I realized that instead of just talking about it, why not do something about it? Why not create my own content? And I found out about the Easter Seals Disability Film Challenge, and it was that perfect fit because it was actually created 10 years ago by an actor named Nick Novicki as a way to give other people with disabilities a chance to create their own content, and to get their work and their talents and their skills seen by people in the industry. And it's grown into like this big thing where there are major studios and networks involved now.
Sounds great. Definitely some amazing work going on in that field and everything. As you were talking, I was trying to think about my local news companies and the local news services, and then I was trying to think about cities that I have visited, and I've not been doing a lot of travel lately, but I was just trying to go in my mind and even on the networks. And I could not think off the top of my head. I'm not saying that there aren't any folks with disabilities that are known or popular news anchors, and is that an area that we need to work on? Because as I was going, I was trying to think if I could think of anybody in a wheelchair or that I knew was disabled that was one of our local news anchors here in Durham, North Carolina. And then I tried to go through my mind and think about like the big networks like ABC, NBC, and those other ones that have offices in New York and California and DC. And I couldn't think of anybody in those spaces as well. And I do know that a lot of the job of the anchor is actually in the office. And well, personally, I think that the folks that are of the different abilities could actually be even doing some of the field reporting, even though there might be some field reporting that might be harder to do than others. But um, am I onto something in the fact that our media outlets are not doing a good enough job of making sure that while they are getting representation of both genders and representations of the various races, that they're not doing a good job of getting opportunities to those that are disabled? Because I can't think of a disabled anchor. I'm sure there might be some, but I just can't think of any. And if you can give me some examples of some that I can go watch or that our audience can go watch, I'm sure that we would love to hear those as well. But I just, off the top of my head, couldn't think of any.
Mark, that's a great point because I can give you many examples of really talented disabled actors who are more in, the narrative space. But I can't, as you were talking, I could not think of one single example of anyone I know here in the U.S. That has a disability and is either a news anchor or field reporter, that's actually on camera. So you're right, and I think you are onto something where there is definitely a lack of representation. In the UK, I know they have a few over there, but yeah, no, I've never, here in New York City, never seen anyone with a disability on, reporting the news, and never heard of it, in other markets as well. And I think, kind of given my position, I probably would have.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I think you would have heard of that, but I just couldn't think of any. Because the other times that I hear of the disabled or the differently able community being talked about, ironically, is in sports. Because I do know that even though it is considered a separate competition, there are a lot of competitions around the different abilities and kind of these Olympics that are oriented toward that audience and everything. But is that something that is that making things more acceptable, the Paralympics and some of the things that are going on in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's an interesting point too, because NBC, which holds the broadcast rights to the Paralympics, actually airs a lot less of the Paralympics on TV than other countries do. So, whereas you can go somewhere in Europe or you could go somewhere in Asia and you can watch the whole thing, it's very hard to actually find that coverage. In the US, it's usually limited to just a couple of hours. It's definitely, I think the last Paralympics, they were better about like at least making it all live stream available. But it compared to, the core, Olympic sport, it definitely does not get the same attention, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate because as you were saying that, I would almost hesitate to guess, and I don't know this for a absolute fact or anything, but I would almost guess that there are probably more folks that don't have a known disability that are doing the reporting of, say, the Paralympics, if that doing that coverage, because I don't know that they're necessarily trying to get a Paralympic athlete to be the commentator, much in the way that you would have like um, a Shaquille O'Neal or a Charles Barkley commenting on the NBA or the college game or things in that space. I would almost hesitate to guess, and like I said, it's strictly a guess because I haven't watched enough of those sports to think that there are probably a lot of more um, non differently abled people that are doing the actual coverage and everything. But that's just a guess on my part. But do you think I might be onto something there as well?
You might be. You might be. I personally also have not seen a lot of it, so I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that either, but it would be interesting to see who is doing the actual coverage in that space. What, and I know we brought it up the last time that I had you and the other guests on about a year or so ago and all in that space, but what do you consider the correct term? Because I've heard some people that don't like the term handicapped. I've heard definitely a word that I am very much appropriately using or trying to use most of the time, which is differently abled. And like we were talking about on the news, there are some handicaps that are or differently abled situations that are easier to recognize. If somebody is in a wheelchair, you see the wheelchair. If they are vision impaired, and particularly if the vision is significantly impaired, you may see the cane, even if they've got diseases like MS that start making things around their own mobility happen. You'll recognize things that are in that space, but then there are some differently able situations that are more in the spectrum and all in those ways. So they're not always easily observable or easily knowable. I think I mentioned before that I have dysgraphia, which is like a form of dyslexia. If we were going somewhere in New York and you wanted me to get somewhere that needed me to go left versus right, you might want to give me a split second or at least a few more seconds than the average person to figure out which way is left and which way is right. But I would get there in time and incorrectly. And definitely is part of the reason of my own not driving because it was something discovered later in life after attempting to drive a couple of times and having a couple of fender benders or a couple of minor, no major accidents, but a couple of minor accidents. And then ironically going to Goodwill. And Goodwill did some of the testing, and that's where they discovered the dysgraphia and all in that space. But is that something that we need to have greater conversations about? Is the diversity of different abilities, and also what do you consider the right terminology?
Yeah, for sure. So, the CDC estimates that about 25% of the US population has a disability of some sorts. That includes folks like me who have cerebral palsy and use wheelchairs, and actually folks like you who have dysgraphia.
Mhm.
So, and it's interesting because now with COVID, actually, that number is there's not been like an official. I think they do it with the census, so we'll see in the next census. But I would say that the number is going to go up because long COVID is actually considered a disability. And long COVID, for those who are not familiar with it, happens in about anywhere from like about 5 to 20% of cases, depending on if people are vaccinated or not, depending on how many vaccines they've had, depending on just their personal like body and biology. But it's actually like people talk a lot about with COVID of hospitalization. They talk about death, but they don't talk enough about long COVID, which can happen even if you're not hospitalized, even if you have a very mild case that feels like a cold. And that could be a number of different symptoms that really impact a lot of people's lives. There are millions of people out of work actually
Right.
because of it, because they have things like chronic fatigue from it. They have things like problems with their heart. So it's actually, it's a very serious condition, and it is increasing the number of people that are disabled in this country. COVID has been a mass disabling event. So, kind of, that being what it is, it's interesting in terms of terminology where it depends on who you ask. And I say that because for the longest time, and this is mostly like it's hard to put a specific age on it, but I would say like people who are considered middle aged and up now have used the term people with disabilities, and that's called people first language. So you would say someone, a person with visual impairment, or you would say a person who is, with hearing impairment to describe someone. That has kind of flipped on its head with the younger generation, I would say, like the Gen Zs and the millennials, particularly the younger millennials, who prefer identity first language. And that's because there's been increasing disability pride, where people do identify as disabled, for example. They identify as blind, they identify as autistic. So, you might meet someone who, is proudly autistic, they'll call themselves autistic. They might not say I'm a person with autism,
Right.
because they feel it's not necessary. So I think, it's a mix of generational and individual preferences. I personally use both interchangeably, and professionally as well, just knowing that, I'm speaking to two different audiences, and like what I have found to be the best, compromise when using language is just to kind of cover off both, and to use both to make sure that everyone feels represented. Definitely, you're right. We don't say handicapped, and that's actually a gag in the movie. So if you watch the film, you'll see that there's a little bit of a joke in there about that particular issue, and the choice of language one of the characters uses.
Yeah. By the way, want to give a shout out. We did have Marcello watching from Atlanta and all that. So definitely appreciate Marcello watching from Atlanta. And he definitely gave a shout out to that New York City state of mind. And he definitely was talking about the diversity that you were talking about earlier as well, saying that diversity in New York City is parallel to any other metropolitan city in the United States and all in that. And definitely he was saying that he was team live. So definitely appreciate Marcella watching from over there in the Atlanta area, which is another great cosmopolitan area. As a matter of fact, I just found out yesterday that my cousin who works in that area, and one of my cousins is actually had the privilege of working, I think, for maybe the fourth or fifth time. He's worked it a number of times, the Masters, because he is a GBI officer. So my cousin Jonathan was actually working that, and maybe this weekend when I hopefully will see him, I'll find out whether he was working the 18th hole or one of the other holes that were going on there at that tournament. I know they had a little bit of a disaster there as well because you got to have security, as I know you know from your work in New York City and everything. And apparently they had one of the trees collapse, and I think there might have been some other things that were going on in that space. So I don't know if he was near that hole or not near that hole, but I'll find out when I catch up with him hopefully this weekend because he'll be coming up for dealing with some family matters. Both of his parents have passed on in all in that sense, but he's actually the one that passed first, which was his mother, was actually the one that he's got to deal with some family matters in that space, and then he might decide to go to the powwow as well. But it's good to catch up with him, and hopefully we'll be catching up with him this particular weekend as well. As you were talking, one of the things I was curious about, Anna, was there are some things that are we don't think about as being disabilities, but I would imagine that there probably are in that differently able or disability community, because a lot of times we think about our physical health, and of course we want to have our physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional health all in tune and everything. But that being said, I know that there is a large portion of the population that deals with things that are skin related, like eczema and things along those lines. And it seems to me that in some ways that could actually maybe even drive the differently able community numbers even higher up and all in that space. Because I do know there's a large portion of people that are dealing with those kind of aspects of their life, whether that is from uh, diet, whether that's from environmental concerns, or whether that is from things that's relevant as funguses and other things. But are there some things that maybe we don't categorize as being part of the differently able community that could be included if we were being more holistic? Because I do know that that is something that I don't think is ever put in those numbers, but I could be wrong. But I was just wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean, and also just in terms of the way that we refer to the community, we usually don't use differently abled. We use disability or disabled community.
Right.
So to answer the question, there's a definition of what is considered a disability, mainly for the purposes of ADA coverage. The ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's the federal law that was passed in 1990 that basically is supposed to prevent discrimination on the basis of disability. And I say supposed to because it's definitely, it's a much appreciated, but it's not a perfect law. But in terms of like what is or isn't a disability, the rule of thumb is it has to, impact your ability to do a major life function. I think something like eczema, it just depends on how severe it is, to be honest. I'm not a doctor, it's not my area of expertise, but certainly, there are, but to your point, I think that, there's just such a range
Yeah.
of what is a disability that people don't always think about, a lot of times. And I think, part of it is like, the official symbol anywhere you go in the world when you're looking for accessibility is like a little wheelchair symbol. So it's like someone who literally looks like me. So when people, see me coming, they're like, wheelchair. Okay, I know that. I know what to do about that, right? Like, okay, stairs bad, ramp that way, elevator this way, right? But when people are talking about things like mental health or things like, the autism spectrum, that presents in so many different ways.
Right.
And there's not really like a lot of times a physical manifestation of it that's easy to see and spot right away. So people's reactions to it are different. And I think there's just like less awareness of the fact that, those things are disabilities, of what those disabilities entail, and how to, accommodate those disabilities, because I think it's all about, we in the disability community, for the most part, are very kind of conscientious about accommodating each other. But outside of the disability community is understanding that there are, certain modifications to like either a policy or a process that could even the playing field for someone who has, a type of disability that might prevent them from equally accessing something, whether it be employment, whether it be, something while they're out shopping, or, something like even entertainment. For example, closed captioning is an accommodation for people who are deaf, or, who can't hear. Open audio descriptions also are an accommodation for people who are visually impaired and can't necessarily see all the action happening on screen.
Yeah.
So there's different forms of that.
Yeah. Do you think that sometimes people have a different reaction to the folks in the disabled community if they're coming at the disability from different times or different statuses in their life? Because you have some people that are born with their disability, like they are automatically born with whatever that disability is. You have others that don't get the disability till much later. I told you my narrative of what went on with the dysgraphia wasn't discovered till I went into the goodwill space. That aunt that I was just referring to earlier actually died of MS, and I have another relative that is suffering from that right now, but they weren't diagnosed until more recently, and all in that space. But they know that eventually they will have to deal with some of the things that the disability community has historically had to deal with, but it's not immediate because MS is a degenerative bone disease, so you don't automatically have to get in a wheelchair, but eventually you will probably be wheelchair bound, and maybe eventually before uh, passing, depending on how you decide to pass and everything, you will probably wind up even being bedridden and all in that space. But that is something that is a long range process. So like when you first get it, you are very much in the ability of getting around, just like you were at the beginning of the diagnosis, and then as you go through the progression, it changes. So I just wondered, is there ways that society accepts more maybe those that have the disease from a childhood standpoint versus those that get it later, whether that is through natural causes or whether that's through an accident or a number of other ways that folks can find themselves into that differently abled space.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, I think ableism is equal opportunity. So I do think that like a lot of times people just see disability and they don't, like they're not really thinking about like, was this person born with it, or, is
Right.
this acquired, maybe it's natural, maybe it's Maybelline, I don't know. I've had my disability from birth, and I think the difference that I've noticed, for the most part, of my friends who have disabilities that they were born with versus ones that acquired them later in life, is I do think that there's, just an aspect of it, for us that were born with our disabilities, that we are very used to this. And this is normal. Like, there's nothing that's not normal about this for me, because this is my life and this has always been my life. I think it's equally frustrating when you get to a place that's not accessible and it should be. And like, of course, like those situations are frustrating no matter what. But I think for people who acquire their disabilities later in life, there's, I think probably a sense of loss that comes with that, because there is that before time. And
Right.
I think that's like, a great analogy to what's happened with COVID is that we all collectively, whether it's, like people have lost family members or they've lost their ability to do something because like COVID, gave them a disability, or they lost a job, or they lost the ability to do their favorite thing for a while. I think, one of the things why people have such strong feelings about, the pandemic is because we've all gone through this collective trauma where we've all lost something. We might have lost different things, but we've all lost something. And some people's ways of dealing with that are adapting. So for me, kind of growing up with a disability, I think has made it easier to adapt. Of like, okay, this is my normal now. I wear a mask, and I can go on and go on with it, and it's not a big deal. But for other people, like putting on a mask for 5 minutes, you would think it's the end of the world, right? Like they haven't adapted, they're in denial. And to your earlier point, there's still like a 9/11's worth of people dying every week of COVID just in the U.S. So it's definitely not the flu. It's definitely not gone away. So
Yeah, but you got some folks that want to make it seem like we're totally done, and I definitely don't think that it is totally done. And I do think, but then there are other folks that will give the argument that this is now just nothing but like the flu, meaning that it's something we will be facing for the duration of our existence as humans and all in that space. So I guess they're trying to put it in the same kind of category of those diseases that we will have to have shots for and have to have uh protection against, but that it won't be going anywhere anytime soon, much in the way that the flu has been out there for a number of years, and much in the way that there have been a number of other things that have been out there for a number of years until an eventual cure was found, much in the way that they found a cure eventually for polio. But it did take decades until that cure to come about, and I'm not even sure that it is 100% uh, treatable in all of the senses, because I think that there are still some folks that have polio, even though it is not nearly what it used to be because of the different shots that are required to make sure that you don't get that, just like you don't get the measles and a number of other things that are out there that have been more conquered than they used to be. But yeah, that's just my thoughts on that and everything. Tell us a little bit about this particular film that you did, and also the last film, because I know we did the last film last time. But if you can just share a little bit about these film narratives and what they are about, and all in that space, so that folks can know what they will be getting if they are to watch the film, and all in that way. And also, if you can tell us ways that folks can go watch the film, should they want to watch the film, and depending on what the ways are, we might even give them a clip or so, or some shots of them and all in that space. But tell a little bit about the film and where folks can find what this is all about.
yeah, absolutely. So last year, I think we were talking about our film Pandora, which was a superhero movie, and that's one of the things with the Easter Seals Challenge as well. So the challenge team provides a theme that everyone has to use every year. This year, it was romance. And so my kind of natural way that I go about things is from the lens of comedy. I'm a sketch comedy writer, and so a lot of members of my team come from the comedy world. And so for us, that meant doing a romantic comedy. And the film that we created this year is called Cryptfish. And that title is a combination of two words. That is catfished, which people might know from the popular MTV show. Is that phenomenon where people go on online dating apps and they pretend to be someone that they're not. So they might post one photo and then the person who shows up in real life is completely different.
Right.
And then it's also the other part of the word, it comes from cryptface, which is this practice in Hollywood where unfortunately they cast non disabled actors and actresses as characters with disabilities. And not only does that mean like the portrayal is likely to be less authentic than someone with that lived experience taking on that role, but it also shuts people with disabilities out from consideration. It shuts them out from opportunities. You have, a lot of famous actors winning Oscars for doing these things, but you don't have like equally talented actors with disabilities having that opportunity to play that role that would get them in front of the Oscars and would get them other roles. So it's kind of like a catch-22 because as a producer, of course, it's understandable. You want a name that is going to get people to buy tickets to the movies, to, stream your content and all that. But if you don't create the pipeline for that talent to get there and to become a household name through these roles, then you're just part of the problem, quite
Well,
honestly.
that makes a lot of sense, and definitely folks are thinking about that. One of the other things that folks sometimes get stereotyped about in all of those lines is this notion, and I think that that's part of what your film is tackling, that some folks will automatically assume that romance is not a part of a person that is differently abled's life and all of that, because there's this notion that you're going to have to sacrifice that part of your life. But I know some folks that are in some very successful relationships, sometimes even with folks that are not like-minded, differently abled, and sometimes they are like two differently abled folks. But I was just wondering, is that something that even in your own life you've had to face, is this stereotype and this belief that romance is outside of the picture because you are dealing with your uh, handicap or your disability and all in that space? But definitely, I do know that that is a stereotype that unfortunately still exists out there. But I was just wondering your take on that.
Yeah, I think that you're spot on. I think that stereotype exists, very much so, and I think part of it is the fact that when you go to the movies or you watch these romantic comedies on TV or whatnot, you watch sitcoms, you don't see people with disabilities as romantic leads. You just don't. And I think that kind of notion where people see that, the media is telling us like, here's what a desirable partner looks like, and that never includes a whole class of people. Like, it's not surprising to me that people, when they're out in the world, would be like, oh no, that's not a romantic lead. Like, swipe left, right? Like, they see a disability, swipe left, because that's not my idea of a romantic lead. Without understanding that the disability doesn't get in the way of all of the key characteristics that are important, for a successful relationship. And I mean, just honestly, like, I've had relationships that that have ended nothing to do with the disability. Quite honestly, we were just not compatible people at the end of
Right.
the day. So yeah. And one of the things in the film, what's really kind of funny, it's about these two actually, queer non-binary individuals. One is queer non-binary, I should say. The other one is a queer woman, and they meet on an online dating app. And one of them, the woman, she is visually impaired, and her preference, because she's had some pretty bad experiences dating non-disabled people, she says her preference is she only wants to date someone with a disability. And this other person, who at the beginning of the movie we see as being non-disabled, is like, oh wow, like, I really like this person, what do I do? And of course they do what you shouldn't do, is they lie, and they pretend to be blind in order to be able to go on the date with this other character.
But that's the other thing that I know folks used to do, and I think I mentioned it to the last time we had you on and everything, is that sometimes people think that they are doing a favor by trying to act in the way of whatever the differently abled person is. And sometimes that might be true bonding, but sometimes folks may think that as being another form of bullying or another form of teasing. But I was just wondering your take on that, because we do know that there are children and even some adults that will intentionally close their eyes and try to move around a building to get a sense of what they think it would feel like to be blind, even though they know that they can open their eye at any moment. So I don't know how much reality they're having in that sense. And we do know that there are folks that will get in the friend or acquaintance's wheelchair and try to motor around in the wheelchair, and sometimes they might even say that they are trying to do that as a way to bond with the person that is having these different reasons for being in said wheelchair. But I was just wondering your thoughts on when folks try to do things to quote unquote bond with folks that are uh, having these different handicap situations.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it all comes down to intentions, right? Like, if someone's truly trying to understand, like, to your point, like, yeah, it would be difficult for them to really understand unless, like, that's going on for a while. But I've had people come up to me, friends who have, let's say, injured themselves and broken a leg, and they're like, no, no, I know what it's like, because they go and they try to, here in New York City, the subway is like, very inaccessible. And they try to get on the subway and they find the elevators don't work, or the elevator is non-existent for for where they want to go, and they're like, oh my god, like, how do you manage? And I never knew, and like it's eye opening for them, right? Like, or they have babies and they push around babies in strollers, because strollers also are things for people who rely on wheels. So, I don't think, like, as long as like it's not malicious, I think, it's always, helpful when you can build understanding. And I'm sure, being, a cisgendered, woman, and probably put like my foot in a couple of times when talking to my cast members who have non-binary genders and who see gender roles differently. So, but I think it's all about intentions, and if you're trying to be an ally, like, that's much appreciated.
And definitely got to have those allies that are there. Speaking of allies, how much I know that there's always been that Disability Act that you alluded to earlier, but I do know that there are a number of buildings that are not always up to code as much as they should be and everything. Even one of the nonprofits that I work for, they're working on some improvements, but it is a historical building, so there are not always the easiest access points for some of the folks that are handicapped and all in that kind of space. There are some handicap aisles, and there are definitely some efforts to deal with it, but it isn't always able to be as much up to code, and part of that might be the historical elements as well. But I'm just wondering, as one that is in New York, there are a lot of historical buildings in New York. There are a lot of newer buildings in New York, and I'm thinking that probably quite a few of those buildings, and you kind of alluded to it even with the subways, are not necessarily the easiest to get around with if you are trying to get around in a wheelchair. And I imagine that was even the case when you were at Columbia and at NYU as well. But how good are we as a society doing to make sure that there is access points for people with the various disabilities?
Yeah, so to your point, I can really only speak to my own disability and my own experience, but
Mhm.
to your point, there's the law and then there's what's done.
Right.
And there's like the physical actually aspect of access, and then there's the attitude aspect of access. And you would believe it or not, like there are times when the physical access is there, but you have someone who is either uncomfortable with disability or just is having a bad day, and it makes it an issue to get that access. So, but I think in terms of like the architecture, New York is a mixed bag. New York has a lot of old buildings that are indeed historical to some extent. New York also has a lot of like beautiful, shiny new skyscrapers, and it just depends, to be honest. Like I've been in places, for example, especially like when I've traveled in hotels, I've been in brand new construction hotels where someone has built the shower in a way that's completely not up to spec, even though the specs have existed for 30 years plus. And just like with no common sense, and like one of my biggest pet peeves, for example, is when they build a shower where the shower head and the controls are on one end, and then all the way on the other end is the seat. So unless you're literally Gumby, or you have unhumanly long arms, you're not going to be able to control the shower while using it. And those are brand new constructions, and that's just not acceptable. So there's the law and there's what's done, in those situations. What's also interesting about the law in historical buildings is there's a big misconception. There is no such thing as a grandfather clause in the ADA.
Hmm.
That does not exist. What the ADA says about buildings that were built before 1990, before the law was passed, and really before 1992, because they did give facilities a 2-year grace period. But anything built before 1992, it doesn't mean that like, okay, like they're exempt forever. If they do major construction work on that facility or that building, they have to the largest extent possible, make it accessible. And I'll give you an example. Like if you have a building that was built before 1990 and it has just one step, that is something that is like very much feasible when you're doing like any kind of major construction at that point, to either get rid of that step or to make sure that you have a portable ramp. And those cost like anywhere from $200 to $500. They're not expensive at all, to help someone in a wheelchair get over that step. So there's no such thing, and you will find businesses that give that excuse, like, oh, we're so sorry, like we're grandfathered, but they're just not aware that the law also applies to them.
Yeah, the law definitely applies to everybody, and they definitely got to do a better job. How are you feeling that the law is doing in terms of making things accessible for folks transportation wise? Because I do know folks that, well, two things. One, I definitely get around myself by mass transit mostly and all in that space. And I definitely see people that are getting on the buses that have different handicaps that they are adjusting. There are definitely efforts to make sure that the front two seats are available to those that are handicapped. And if they're not available, if their handicapped slots aren't being used, then they might make them available to folks that are needing to adjust their groceries and things along that space that might be more elderly and have other capacity issues. But the first priority is to those that are actually in wheelchairs. I do know that they allow the seeing eye dogs because I've seen them a couple of times on the bus and some of the other aid animals that exist, even though I've only seen dogs. I can't think of any birds or cats or other animals that I have actually observed as of yet here in Durham. But I just wondered, do you think that the transportation is doing a good enough job in terms of mass transit, in terms of addressing the need for accommodations for folks with particularly wheelchair bound folks? And like I said, I know that what goes on, what I just described is what's happening here in Durham. I imagine it's similar in New York, but you just said that there are very popular things like the subways that aren't always accessible. But how are we doing in the sense of making sure that things are accessible?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a mixed bag here for transportation. Transportation is definitely one of the biggest challenges as far as accessibility goes. And it's interesting everywhere I've traveled, like there's the good and the bad. I have not been to a place yet, except for maybe like Tokyo in Japan, where transportation was legit perfect. And it was just so easy to use and so easy to get everywhere, like no matter what. But here in New York, it is challenging. The subway, only about a little over 30% of it is actually accessible in terms of having accessible stations. There is an ongoing lawsuit where a federal judge, is requiring the state and the city to invest in making 95% of the station accessible, but that's not going to happen until 2055. So by the time I'm a senior citizen, maybe I'll be able to get on the subway for the most part. The stops near many tourist attractions are accessible, but the problem is the elevators are often out of order. So even if you're at a stop that has an elevator and supposedly is ADA accessible, that's not really a reliable form of transportation. The buses here are definitely better access wise because they're very similar to the buses in Durham that you described, where they do have two spots, and mostly the drivers are very accommodating and do a good job. But they can be very crowded. They can be also very slow because we do have a lot of traffic here in the city. One of the developments that's just been, like, for me personally, a major game changer is a few years ago the city required that any of the ride shares, Uber or Lyft, if they wanted to add any new vehicles to the road, they would all have to be the accessible type of vehicle that allows a wheelchair user to roll in through a ramp into the back of a minivan or in the middle of a minivan. And now, for me, it's been very easy to access Uber Waves, where like one will usually come in under 10 minutes any time of day or night, which is amazing. And it's so helpful to get around, but that's also expensive and it's not an option for everyone. So it is still challenging, but the fact that we have accessible Ubers now and accessible taxis is definitely helped. In a lot of cities where I've gone, they don't have those things. So, like, if, for example, I went to LA and on paper they do have accessible Ubers, but good luck ever getting one. I think in the 5 days I was there, this was in 2018 or 2019, maybe I got one to actually come for me once, and it took over half an hour.
Well, that's a long time for that to be happening
Yeah.
and all in that space. So definitely I can see that. There's been a lot of talks about newer forms of folks getting around and identifying everything. A lot of people are very much excited about virtual reality and augmented reality and things in that kind of space. Has that been a conversation within the differently able community? I know earlier when we were talking about the news and the news show World Edition, we had the conversation around handicaps, and I do know Jacoby brought up some of the things that are being done in that space. But I was just wondering, as an advocate, is that something that you are seeing and are excited about, or is it something that you would not as excited about? I was just wondering your thoughts around these kind of newer tools to help those that are differently abled and all in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some cool things about VR in terms of like being able to do things you might not normally be able to do.
Right.
Like I think like I tried out a couple of years ago and did like a rock climbing game, and that's not something I typically would be able to do. So it was kind of fun to have that experience for sure. I know that there's some people who, even before the pandemic, really didn't have, they had a hard time leaving their homes, and so the internet, as a whole, and social networking has been a boon to them of being able to like create and maintain social relationships without having to be in the same physical space. And I think virtual reality has definitely been helpful. There used to be a game called Second Life, and actually, I know a friend of mine met her, former husband on Second Life. So it's one of those things where there are, those spaces that do create opportunities. Do I think it's a big game changer? Not really, because I don't think there's an easy way to replace it. I think we're seeing that now with everything like Meta is not doing too well, and that's because of like Zuckerberg's investment in the metaverse, which is not a thing, and I don't see it becoming a thing for like the majority of the population.
Yeah, we can definitely see that, and it'll be interesting to see what goes on in that space. I don't think you have any of that I recall, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. But are we doing enough in the differently abled space and the handicapped space in our school systems? Because I know there have been a lot of conversations around that as well. I did allude to your own college background, but even in the grade school space, are we doing enough to make sure that kids that are facing different situations, whether that's wheelchairs or being blind or a number of other things, are being accommodated and are getting the best education possible in your mind and from what you've seen in New York City and around your world travels?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very hard for me to say because I'm not a parent, and it's been quite a few years, even though I look 21, since I've been in school. So I, honestly don't have expertise on that topic, but I think like everywhere else, you have people who understand their obligations under the law, and then you have people who make things unnecessarily difficult.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense and everything. Well, I did find it. So, one thing I was going to ask you really quickly before giving a shout out and getting a chance for folks to get a view of what Cryptfish is all about, if that's okay with you, and all in that space and everything. Because I was doing some quick searching and found it, and I did find the video and all in less than 5 minutes. So we can watch it in the entirety if you like and everything, or we can cut it short whenever you tell me to, and I'll in that space. But it does look like there's a whole lot of competition because I did see a number of films there, and I think that the finalists will be announced on. I think it was the 22nd, if I saw the date correctly, and all in that. And then sometime in May or something further down will be when the winners will be announced, or the full winner, and all in that space. But I did see some of the information. I may have the absolute ending date wrong, but I knew the April 22nd was the finalist date and all in that space. But I just wondered if you could share a little bit about this competition and how many competitors there are, because this sounds like this has got a whole heap of competitors that are involved in this competition.
Yeah, so the Easter Seals Disability Film Challenge, like I mentioned before, it's in its 10th year, and they do an incredible job of just sourcing such high quality work. Just proud of my team, but also proud of so many teams that have submitted movies that I've been watching all weekend and just have been blown away by. And this year they have a record 115 entries, and people enter from all over the world. From also some teams from here in New York City in the area, a lot of teams from LA and the Hollywood scene. But yeah, people can enter from wherever they are. You just have to have at least one person with a disability on your team. My team, I would say about 80% of us are disabled in real life, including 5 out of 6 of the actors that you see on screen. And that's something that, as a director and producer, is very important to me. I write scripts kind of like, for lack of a better term, blind to any kind of externalities. So I write characters. I don't write disabilities. I don't write ethnicities. I don't even write genders. That all is open to change. And once we cast and we find out which actors are playing which roles, that's where I'll go in and revise the script and make it kind of specific to whatever that is, that disability, that ethnicity, that gender. Because at the end of the day, my philosophy is people are people, and just we're always looking for, as directors, we're always looking for the best performer for that particular character and that character's personality.
No, that makes a lot of sense. You definitely got to have those situations going on where you're looking for the best and all along those lines. I actually realized this earlier today, but apparently they were having some issues with the loading of the videos on StreamYard, the platform that we use here, and everything. But as with everything, there's always an end around that can be used to get through situations when those kind of things happen in that space. So I've already figured out the end around and all in that way. So we're going to get to deal with this and go with the end around situation so that we don't have to worry about that. Because if one thing doesn't work, you go to the plan B and all in that way. So you can still show the old fashioned way, which is sharing the screen and all in that way. So we're going to do that and to have folks catch the whole notion of what is going on with this lovely film that Anna has done. So let's check out Cryptfish.
So, Mark, I'm just gonna. We can't play the whole thing, unfortunately. But we can. Why don't we go to about the middle point of it, and we can watch a short. Maybe about. Let's see. Let me see on my end where we can go and start. But while I'm looking, I want to tell people where they can find it. So if you go
Yeah.
to, as Mark has done, the Easter Seals Disability Film Challenge, YouTube or Facebook or Instagram pages, it's called Cryptfished. It's there. So yeah, why don't you start a little bit before when we about the 2 minute 20-second mark where we see the waitress.
Okay.
Um, maybe a little earlier than that. Sorry, before that. There we go. Let's the two. Yeah, let's go here, and we
Okay.
can watch until the waitress leaves,
Okay. That'll work. So
or
we'll
after,
go
or
watch.
after she says it's the plots of the movie Daredevil.
Yep. We definitely get that clip and everything. That'll work, definitely work. So we'll go from here to about the time that the waitress leaves.
Hello. Did you have a chance to look at the menu? What can I get you?
Oh, well, we can't see the menu. We're both very blind.
Oh my god, I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I had my phone read it to me. The review said the spaghetti carbonara is pretty good.
Oh, well, 2 spaghettis then.
Really good, okay.
And also, could you play some Stevie Wonder for us? We'd like to hear the music of our people.
Yeah, I'll go ask.
I'm sorry. Is this new for you?
Dating? No. I've gone out with lots of people. It's just that I never had this kind of connection the way we had when we were chatting.
No, I mean your disability. When did you become blind?
Oh, that, yeah. It's pretty recent. Radioactive chemical spillage. I was a kid.
That was a little bit of a clip of it, and folks can definitely go and watch more of it. But definitely, I love that notion of even the Stevie Wonder joke and being among our people and all along those lines. So definitely, I think folks can definitely catch a little bit of what the whole film was about, and definitely hope that folks will go watch more of it and all along those lines. But yeah, I was over there chuckling over some of those lines and all in that space. So I hope that that was at least a taste of what it was all about, and hopefully folks will watch it and go watch more of it in that particular space and everything. But I think that they got about a good minute of the a 5 minute film or something along those lines. But hopefully folks will go and watch the entirety. I know I plan to watch the entirety and all in that space, but I was already chuckling at what I did see and all in those lines.
Yeah, well, Mark, thank you so much for sharing this with your audience.
Oh yeah, glad to do that. And I definitely want folks to go and catch it more and everything. One of the other things that I saw, and I don't know if you have any thoughts, and I'm gonna see if I can find the person and everything. But there was a major person that was involved in the um, Easter Seals community. I was trying to see if I could find their name, but it did look like there was a couple of things around Easter Seal, and I'm thinking this person must have recently passed and all along those lines. But I did see some things in the Easter Seals website about that particular individual, and I don't know if you know who I'm talking about, but I did see that it was there on the Easter Seals page and all in that way. And I'm trying to see if I can find it, but it was something I saw earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be talking about Judy Human, who is
Yes.
just such an icon in the disability rights movement. She was one of the sort of pioneers of getting the ADA passed to begin with, and definitely a tragic loss for our whole community.
Yeah, that's the one I was referring to and everything. It definitely sounded like it was a great loss to the community to lose such a powerful advocate in that space and all in that way and everything. So I know that a lot of times we don't honor those while they are with us, but we definitely should honor them while they're with us, but also after they have passed as well. So yeah, that is exactly who I was referring to, and I just wanted to bring that up so the folks can go and research this amazing person that you said was involved in some of the ADA movement also. So that's what I was going to bring that part of the conversation as well. As we get ready to wrap up, and I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation here on the radio show with Mark Lee. You know, one of the things that I do with everybody is definitely have them give any other thoughts that they would like to share with our audience, just in general. And of course, you know, I'm all about trying to spread positivity and hope in general. So if you had any message of positivity and hope, and if there's any things that you would like to share with our general viewing audience in general, so that folks can go back and hear more of what is going on in Anna Paquin's life as well, then this would be the time to do that. So I might even give you the full screen so that you can have the moment to yourself to share a little bit about one, ways that folks can get in touch with you, two, any thoughts that you have in general, and of course, any messages of positivity and hope. And then I'll be back with any wrapping comments and all in that line. But I'll give you the full camera screen right now.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mark. It's always great to talk to you, and I appreciate our time together as I do with all your listeners. So, if you want to get in touch, you can find me across social media at Anna Tated. So that's ANNATATED. And you can watch the movie Cripfish. I've been posting a lot about it. So, if you just want to follow me, you see my handle on the screen as well. And in terms of a message, so I think one of the biggest takeaways from the movie is actually, one of the things I'll share today is just to always be proud of who you are. It's important that we find pride in ourselves.
Definitely appreciate that, and definitely appreciate those positive comments and all along those lines and everything. Just really quickly, as we're heading out the door and everything, how much has it been easier to work in filmmaking in this new hybrid world that we're in? Because I know a lot of people are saying we're never going to go back to being fully back in the office and everything, and that a lot of the work will be done mostly from home, but or a combination of home and the workforce. There's even been pushes about trying to get 3 and 4 day work weekends. And I know some corporations are trying to push their people to come back to the office, and most people are kind of pushing back, going like, no, I kind of like it at home and I want to work from home and all in that space. But I'm just wondering your thoughts about that. And is this going to be the new normal? Because I noticed that even in the performing arts space, we're seeing more events that are actually in person, but then for folks that either can't get to the event or don't want to get to the event because of their concerns around their own health, they're able to see it through live streaming and a number of other means of going to even like Broadway shows and stuff like that. But I was just wondering, is this the new norm? Is this something we're going to have to deal with for probably centuries and everything? But what is your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like the pandemic has definitely forced technology's hand, but the technology, I think there's always disruption from technology, right? Where we have the technology to do something differently or something new, and, we start using it and we see that there's a better way forward than we had before. And, part of this with what technology has allowed for telework, I think like you kind of have to look at everything kind of objectively. And there are certain activities or certain like roles that are not really compatible with telework, right? Like someone who's a cashier in a supermarket can't zoom into that job. Like there's just no way to do that. That has to be an in-person role. And I think what's interesting about hybrid and filmmaking in particular, and I can just talk to my experience with this production, is and past productions I've done, is that there are pieces of it that do not need to be done in person at all. Like, for example, the whole writing process. Like, there's nothing about that process that requires you to sit in a room with other people and get that done. Like, your viewers will see the film, you will see the film. It is very funny. We did that. We actually had people in our writers' room from across the world. We had a guy, in India, and we're all the better for it because he's also like actually blind. So it was helpful to have his perspective as, a blind person working on a film that was about blind people, which is not my disability experience, right? Like, I need help in that area. Like, just because I'm a disabled person doesn't mean I know everything about every disability. So we would not have been able to work together because he wouldn't fly to New York to do this. So that opens up like a whole host of opportunity when you're thinking about like talented people and the right people. They're not always at your doorstep. And that also creates opportunities for people like him being in New Delhi, where he can work with a team that's mainly New York based. We also had a woman in the movie who's been on, a number of runways and like a major TV show, who lives in Los Angeles, and we would not benefit from her participation in the movie if we weren't able to be flexible and actually allow her to zoom in to film her part. So, there were parts of the movie when it comes to production, though, that, it did make sense for them to be in person. It's a romance. Like, I'm going to spoil it. There's a kiss at the end. Very hard to do a kiss over Zoom. Like that is hard. That is legitimately next to impossible to do. But in the world we're in, what I was talking about earlier is like, you can't be complacent and you can't live in denial. In person, and unfortunately, like a lot of people are not doing this, but what we did for, our production, and, part of this was that the Screen Actors Guild, there are a few actors on my set who were SAG. And so I had to do this, but, I went above and beyond the current SAG requirements, and we did rapid PCR tests. So like there was no way we were going to be endorsed together without everyone on the team being tested. And that gave us, the test that we use. It has a 98% degree of confidence that, if you're negative on that test, there's a 98% chance you don't have COVID. The rates here in New York City, thankfully, have been a bit lower than they have been for the past year. So that 98% on top of the already lowered rates meant that, we could, do this and we could make it safe. Other things that we did, on top of that, because, you want to get, you're never going to get, to zero, but you want to get as close to zero as possible, because the consequences of what happens if this virus spreads to the wrong person, are horrible. One of our team members actually had been in the hospital, a young woman had been in the hospital just a month ago with COVID pneumonia. So when people say no one's getting sick, like COVID doesn't exist, and it's only people who are like near their deathbed, anyway, that is 100% not true. This is like a very vibrant young person who, yes, does have pre-existing conditions. That's what many disabilities are. But other than that, is like out there working full time, out there living her life, and would definitely not have been in the hospital if not for COVID. And that, in addition to just being health conscious, was definitely a wake up call of like, we can take chances, especially being a group of people with disabilities, almost all of us having, certain risk factors. And so on top of that, we had HEPA filters, and those are hospital grade filters that basically pull virus out of the air. We also had windows open for most of the time if we were indoors, just to improve the ventilation, because the virus can't really spread that well in areas which are well ventilated. And then as just an extra layer of precaution, anytime that anyone was not actively being filmed on camera, we were masking. We were using high quality KN95 masks that offer both great filtration and great fit. And so that was all really important, because we actually, I will tell you, did have a positive case in our group. So we did our testing at the very beginning of the day. And one of the actresses who was actually cast to play the lead, you don't see her in the movie because she wasn't able to participate because she actually had no symptoms and tested positive for COVID. And if we didn't have all of those safety measures in place, it very well could have been the case that, we would not have had a happy ending. So those things, if you want to do things in person, by all means do it. But, I think we have to recognize we're in a world where we need to take certain measures, and these are small measures. As a producer, they cost me less than $15 per person to implement that. But these are small, easy to do measures. They don't stop anyone from enjoying anything. And we can all do these things together, but do them safely.
Man, that makes a lot of sense. I was actually, as you were saying that, I was thinking about as folks are thinking that it is winding down or that it's almost over or whatever. I was thinking about one of the haphazards that exist out in society that I don't think is being paid enough attention to. There are some folks that will think that the climate is not an issue and everything, but I'm going like, how many people are wearing these masks and then not properly disposing of the mask? Because I know that even when I get on the bus, that is one of the frustrations that I see, and I definitely have done the vaccination protocol. Even I think I might be due a shot or two, and all in that space for those that are, thinking that is the way to go. But definitely, even if you have those, it still is a good idea to wear protective mask and all in that space. And I can tell you that I oftentimes see many a mask just laying strewn on the floor after somebody has worn them. I'm sure up there in a big city like New York, you probably run across that all the time, whether it's in your apartment complex or out and about in that big metropolitan city. But I'm thinking that that's got to be a climate disaster waiting to happen if it hasn't already happened.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I think everyone needs to act responsibly for sure, and like climate is a big issue, but at the same time, just in terms of like how much are one or two people like just throwing their mask in the wrong place contributing to climate change versus these big corporations that are
Right.
polluting en masse. Like I think there have even studies of like even the whole issue of plastic straws, like not using plastic straws is not going to make a dent in climate change. I think it's a distraction from what actually needs to be done, and regulation that needs to happen to stop the major polluters from polluting our environment.
No, yeah, definitely got to work on those major polluters. I think I had mentioned on a past show that I was a big fan of a book called Ecology, and that's actually what he used to do with some very radical protests and all in that space. Because he would literally go, and he's since passed on many years ago, but he would literally go into like a major corporation in like the Midwest or something, and if the corporation was killing the fish, you would find those dead fish and find that toxic fish and literally dump it in the corporate headquarters so that they knew personally what they were creating and all in that space. So sometimes you have to do those rebellious kind of actions in order to get the attention. And that's just my thoughts on the matter. But definitely, it has been a thorough pleasure having you on again, and definitely look forward to having you back anytime that you want to come. Anytime you want to bring some of your fellow filmmakers on, you're always welcome and always glad to have you on a regular basis or whenever you're able to come, because I know you're a very busy lady, keeping busy with the film work and some of the digital work and other things that you are always active in that space. But you always have a home to share stuff here at, and definitely I can say that is the somewhat de facto program director for Pod TV. So anytime you have things that you want to show, including the old one and all in that space, we'll be definitely glad to make this a available space for you to show whatever works you want to show whenever they're available to be shown. But if there are any final thoughts you've got, otherwise we'll get ready to show a couple of PSAs. Speaking of things that need to happen in the world and all in that space, and get ready to get on out of here. But if you have any final thoughts, I would love to hear those. Otherwise, we'll get ready to have a couple of PSAs and get ready to get on out of here.
Yeah, no, just again, thank you so much for having me on. Always a pleasure.
Hey, it's always a pleasure having you on as well. So, like I said, we're going to a couple of very important public service announcements and things in that space, and get ready to get on out of here. And definitely want to share some of the wisdom, including some of the things that we are dealing with in society and all in that way. So right now we're going to have one about pet care and foster care in general. But definitely I know that I used to have a pet and don't have any at the moment. So at some point I've got to get another pet in my life. But and definitely I know people are also thinking about human foster care as well. So Anna, do you have any pets over there in that house of yours, or are you done with no? Uh, she's shaking her head. No pets at all.
Unfortunately, no.
Cool. Well, right now let's get out of here with a couple of these announcements, including the very real situation around fentanyl and a couple of other things. But after that, we'll be done, and we've got some more programming, including Maxine, that'll be talking about some of her great conversations with leaders of the community. It comes our way at 7 o'clock. And of course, we've got the All Around Show, and Dr. Anthony will be talking to educators. And then we've got the Gaming Show later tonight at around 10. And also, I think around 9 or 10, we've got our Automobile Show as well. So all kinds of great programming here on Pod TV. But right now, let's get ready to get on out of here. But here's a couple of those important public service announcements.
So much.
Fostering a pet for a friend or neighbor can keep families together. Learn more at petsandpeopletogether.org.
A lethal dose is in here. Who gets it? I won't know.
Scary that it can be put into anything and we can't even see it or notice it.
You heard me. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that's impossible to detect by sight, smell, or taste. It's showing up in illicit drugs and counterfeit prescription pills, putting our kids at risk. Learn the facts and start a life-saving conversation with your kid.
Hi, I'm Ryan Blaney, a third-generation race car driver, and we dedicate a lot of our time to going as fast as possible. My grandpa Lou is the reason why my dad and I started racing, and I'm really proud to follow in his tracks. But when my grandpa was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, it was a very unexpected bump in the road for us. I've learned a lot on this journey with my grandpa Lou, and the memories of my grandpa will always be with me. And in our family, we're used to getting involved, and I encourage you to do the same, especially when it comes to caring for your loved ones. When I think about Alzheimer's and the impact it had on my family, I recognize that losing a race isn't such a bad day after all. It's important to notice if older family members are acting differently, experiencing problems with their memory, or having trouble with routine tasks. Talking about Alzheimer's can be really tough, but if you notice something, have a conversation with your loved one. Encourage them to see a doctor or offer to go with them. Early detection of Alzheimer's can give your family time to explore support services, make a plan for the future, and access available treatments. If you or your family are noticing changes, it could be Alzheimer's. Talk about seeing a doctor together.
You can talk to me if you're feeling sad.
Thanks for hearing me out, bro.
Whenever you need to talk, I'm here, okay?